When a war hero vanishes from his grand home on Ashcombe Hill, Miss Marple uncovers that behind his elegant wife's calm smile lies a chilling secret, a murder planned with perfect domestic precision. Welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I am so glad you joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lover from all over the world. The Widow of Ashcombe Hill. Chapter 1. The Missing Husband. It was one of those misty mornings in late October when Ashcombe Hill looked more like a painting than a village, a pale wash of greys and silvers, with thin smoke rising from chimney pots and damp leaves pressed against the cobblestones. A robin sang from a thorn bush, and in the distance the church bell tolled 8 times, muffled slightly by the fog. Inside the post office, the morning chatter was already in full swing. Mrs. Turner, the postmistress, was discussing the price of milk when the door opened suddenly, letting in a breath of cold air and a woman wrapped in a long wool coat. Her hair was neatly pinned, her gloves immaculate, and her face as white as the mist outside. "Mrs. Turner," she said softly, her voice composed but trembling at the edges. "I must telephone the police at once. My husband, he's gone missing." The post office fell silent. Only the tick of the clock on the wall broke the stillness. Mrs. Turner, a woman who never failed to notice the slightest tremor in a neighbour's voice, adjusted her spectacles and looked up. "Missing, you say, Mr. Latham?" "Yes, Captain Latham," replied the woman, her gloved hand gripping the counter. "He didn't come home last night. He was meant to go to the barracks for a meeting, but he never returned. I'm terribly worried." Mrs. Turner's eyes widened slightly. Captain Matthew Latham was a name spoken with both respect and a touch of awe in Ashcombe Hill, a decorated war hero, tall, charming, and unfailingly polite. His wife, Jennifer, was known for her beauty, composure, and an air of quiet sophistication that made others feel slightly untidy in her presence. Together, they were the very image of a perfect English couple. Or so everyone believed. Within an hour, the small village was abuzz. The milkman had seen Captain Latham's car still parked in the driveway at dawn. The gardener swore he'd heard voices late in the night, and Mrs. Barker, who lived across the lane, told anyone who would listen that she'd seen a light flickering upstairs at an unholy hour. By midday, 2 uniformed policemen were at the Latham residence, a stately Georgian house with ivy creeping up its stone façade and white roses still blooming near the porch, despite the chill. Miss Marple, who had been visiting her old friend Mrs. Bartlett for a fortnight, happened to be passing by on her morning walk. She stopped by the hedge, watching quietly as the officers knocked on the grand oak door. Her friend, Mrs. Bartlett, a brisk woman with a fondness for embroidery and gossip, came puffing up behind her. "My dear Jane, have you heard? Captain Latham is missing. The most dreadful business. Poor Mrs. Latham is beside herself." Miss Marple's eyes remained on the doorway. "Is she, indeed?" she murmured gently. "I suppose it is only natural to be distressed under the circumstances." Mrs. Bartlett nodded earnestly. "Oh, indeed, though I must say she looked rather composed when I saw her just now, not hysterical as one might expect." "Some women," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "find tears terribly inconvenient when there's something to hide. Or to plan." Mrs. Bartlett blinked. "Hide? Whatever do you mean?" But Miss Marple didn't answer. Her eyes were following Jennifer Latham, who had just stepped into the doorway to greet the officers. Even at a distance, the elderly lady could see that the woman's poise was near perfect, her posture straight, her voice calm, her hands clasped neatly before her. Only the faint tightness around her eyes betrayed any emotion. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and polish. The drawing-room was immaculate. No sign of disorder, no sign of panic. A tray of tea sat untouched on the table beside an open book and a pair of spectacles. "Mrs. Latham," said Inspector Graves kindly, removing his hat. I understand your husband failed to return home last night." "Yes," Jennifer replied softly. "He left around 8 o'clock to meet a fellow officer. He said he might be late, but he always calls. When I woke up this morning and saw his bed untouched, I knew something was wrong." "And there's been no message, no note?" "None." The inspector jotted a few notes, his expression polite but cautious. "Did you notice anything unusual yesterday evening? Any argument, disturbance, or visitor?" Jennifer hesitated just a fraction too long. "No, nothing at all. We dined together, and he left shortly after." Her tone was smooth, but her eyes flickered briefly toward the window, a small, involuntary movement that Miss Marple would have noticed immediately. Outside, word spread faster than the fog could lift. Some villagers whispered that Captain Latham had run off, tired of his wife's cold manners. Others murmured of debts, affairs, and secret quarrels. But by evening, the official word was clear. Captain Matthew Latham was missing, presumed to have left home voluntarily. Miss Marple, however, did not agree. That evening, as she and Mrs. Bartlett sat by the fire, the topic naturally returned to the case. The rain had begun to fall softly outside, and the old clock on the mantel ticked with comforting steadiness. Mrs. Bartlett sighed. Such a pity. They always seemed such a fine couple. 3 lovely children, a beautiful home. You'd never think there was trouble there. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Appearances, my dear, are much like wallpaper. Pretty to look at, but quite adept at covering cracks. Did you notice, perhaps, how spotless her drawing-room was when the police arrived? I dare say not even a cushion was out of place." Mrs. Bartlett frowned. "Well, Jennifer Latham is known to be a tidy woman." "Oh, quite," said Miss Marple with a faint smile. "But there's tidy, and then there's sterile. Lavender polish has its charm, but when it's strong enough to sting the nose, one begins to wonder what it's meant to conceal." Her friend looked startled. "Jane, you don't think—" Miss Marple set her teacup down gently. "I think, my dear, that people rarely vanish into thin air, and that Mrs. Latham's calmness is not that of grief, but of calculation. She reminds me of Mrs. Henderson, the vicar's wife in Little Paddock, who remained perfectly composed after her husband's unfortunate boating accident, until one noticed she'd replaced the entire carpet in the sitting-room the very next day." Mrs. Bartlett shuddered. "Surely you're not suggesting murder?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice was serious. "I never suggest, my dear. I merely observe. But I should be most interested to know when Mrs. Latham last ordered household goods, particularly a new mattress." The next morning brought a light drizzle and a fresh round of gossip. The grocer claimed Mrs. Latham had been seen walking toward the village telegraph office late that night. The butcher mentioned she had purchased an unusual quantity of bleach and carpet soap 2 days earlier. And young Annie, the maid who once worked at Ashcombe House, whispered to her aunt that she'd been dismissed suddenly after finding a dreadful stain in the master's room. Miss Marple listened quietly, knitting needles clicking as she sat in Mrs. Bartlett's parlour. "People can be very careless with their tongues," she said mildly. "And yet in every careless word there's a sliver of truth. One simply has to know which piece fits the puzzle." By afternoon, she decided to pay a friendly call on Mrs. Latham. Jennifer received her with perfect politeness, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The widow, for Miss Marple could already sense that was what she truly was, offered tea and biscuits, but her hands shook slightly as she poured. Miss Marple smiled gently, her manner all warmth and sympathy. "My dear, I was so sorry to hear of your husband's disappearance. Such dreadful uncertainty must be hard to bear." Jennifer's lips trembled faintly. Yes, it's unbearable." Miss Marple's gaze wandered lightly across the room. The faint scent of ammonia, the new rug that didn't quite match the others, and a fresh delivery slip tucked under a vase on the mantelpiece. "Such a beautiful home," she murmured softly, "and so very clean. You must take great pride in keeping it so." Jennifer's smile was tight. "I like things to be in order." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said, rising slowly. "Order can be very comforting after chaos, though sometimes it's the chaos that tells the truer story." When she left the house, the air was damp and still. Miss Marple paused at the gate, looking back once more at the grand, silent home on Ashcombe Hill. "Vanished husbands, new mattresses and spotless floors," she murmured. "I fear, dear Matthew Latham, that you've not gone very far at all." Chapter 2. The Perfect Marriage. For the next several days, Ashcombe Hill was alive with whispers. The disappearance of Captain Matthew Latham had stirred something restless beneath the village's genteel calm. At the bakery, at the butcher's, even in the vicarage garden, people spoke in low tones as though the hedges themselves might be listening. To some, it was a tragic mystery. To others, it was the inevitable crack in a picture too perfect to be true. For years, the Lathams had been regarded as the model couple. He, a decorated hero of the King's Regiment, known for his quiet discipline and the crisp way he folded a newspaper. She, a beauty with impeccable manners and a knack for making others feel both charmed and slightly inferior. Miss Marple, however, knew from long observation that perfection is a fragile disguise, and in the Lathams' case the disguise had begun to crumble long before anyone noticed. It was 3 days after the disappearance when Miss Marple found herself in the company of Mrs. Plummer, the housekeeper who had worked at Ashcombe House until recently. The woman, a broad-shouldered creature with red hands and sharp eyes, had been at the grocer's selecting tea when Miss Marple happened to remark upon the weather, a favourite conversational door through which many secrets had been known to walk. "Dreadful damp, isn't it?" said Miss Marple cheerfully, tugging her shawl closer. "Makes one's joints ache." Mrs. Plummer sniffed. "Aye, and worse for those living up on the hill. All that stone, cold as the grave that house is." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested casually on her arm. "Ah, yes, Ashcombe House. You were employed there, I believe?" Mrs. Plummer hesitated, but curiosity got the better of caution. 2 years I did, till she let me go last month. Said she wanted a change in staff." Never trust a lady who says that." Miss Marple nodded mildly. "Mrs. Latham always seemed most particular." "That she was," the woman agreed, lowering her voice. "Everything had to be spotless, but it weren't tidiness, not really. It were control. Every cushion in its place, every drawer locked. And Captain Latham, kind man he was, you could tell she near drove him mad with her ways. He'd sit there of an evening, not a word spoken between them. She'd watch the clock while he read his paper." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Not the most companionable arrangement, I imagine?" "Far from it," Mrs. Plummer said, leaning closer. "There were quarrels, quiet ones, mind you, but sharp enough. Once I heard him tell her, 'You can't rule a marriage like a regiment,' and she said, 'Oh, I remember it plain. Someone must or we'll fall apart.' Cold as frost she was, but she had a temper too, only it burned the way a candle does. Slow and steady till there's nothing left but wax." Miss Marple thanked her politely, bought a small tin of cocoa she didn't need, and returned to Mrs. Bartlett's cottage deep in thought. That afternoon she and Mrs. Bartlett shared tea while the rain pattered softly against the window. "People do speak so freely, Jane," said Mrs. Bartlett, shaking her head. "But surely if there were trouble between them, Captain Latham would have confided in someone. Men like that always have friends." "Indeed they do," said Miss Marple, "and I should imagine that Captain Latham's friends would be most interesting to speak with if one could find the right pretext." As it happened, the right pretext presented itself the following day, when a certain Major Giles Pembroke arrived in the village. A tall, barrel-chested man with a trimmed moustache and an affection for brandy, he had served with Matthew Latham in North Africa and now lived a few miles away in Chelmsford. He called upon the police first, then upon Mrs. Latham, and finally, by coincidence, upon Mrs. Bartlett's cottage, where Miss Marple happened to be having tea once again. "My dear Mrs. Bartlett," he boomed, taking her hand with a gallant bow, "I hear you've taken up residence near the scene of all this unpleasantness. Dreadful thing what's happened to poor Latham." Mrs. Bartlett introduced Miss Marple with pride. "Major Pembroke, this is my old friend, Miss Marple. She has the most extraordinary gift for noticing things." "Ah, a lady of observation, eh?" The Major chuckled, though there was little humour in his eyes. "Well, perhaps you'll agree with me then. This business smells wrong. Latham wouldn't just vanish. He wasn't the sort to desert his family." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "You knew him well, Major?" "Like a brother, ma'am. We served together for years. Solid fellow, level-headed. Though in the last year he wasn't quite himself. Wrote me a letter, you know, about domestic difficulties. Said he was sleeping at the barracks more often than not. Couldn't find peace at home." "Domestic difficulties?" asked Miss Marple gently. The Major hesitated, swirling the brandy Mrs. Bartlett had kindly poured. "Yes, he hinted that Mrs. Latham had moods. He put it delicately, of course, but I gathered there were quarrels. Said she was controlling, jealous. Once accused him of impropriety with a neighbour, which was absolute nonsense." Miss Marple listened quietly. "How unfortunate," she murmured. "And yet she bears herself with remarkable composure for a woman whose husband may be lost. Or worse." "Ah, that's Mrs. Latham for you," said Pembroke grimly. "Ice and iron, that one, but if you ask me, she knows more than she's letting on." 2 days later, Miss Marple walked into the village to post a letter and found herself intercepted by Inspector Graves, who had begun to grow uneasy about the whole affair. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, tugging his hat. "You've heard about this Latham business, I expect?" "I have indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And I'm sure you've been most thorough." Graves gave a modest shrug. "We've spoken to the staff, checked the roads, even questioned her relatives. No trace of him anywhere. But something doesn't sit right. House too clean, too calm. It's as though someone scrubbed the life out of it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A keen observation, Inspector. Might I ask, has Mrs. Latham made any recent household purchases? New furniture, perhaps?" Graves looked at her sharply. "As a matter of fact, yes. A new mattress delivered 2 days after her husband went missing. Claimed it was long overdue." "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple." "Oh, not so sharp as all that," she said modestly. "Only experience. When a woman replaces a bed so soon after her husband's disappearance, one begins to wonder what she wishes not to dream upon." The inspector blinked, then gave a low whistle. "You think she—" "I think, Inspector," said Miss Marple softly, "that murder often dresses itself as grief, and tidiness is its perfume." That evening, as the lamps flickered in Mrs. Bartlett's parlour, Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting a grey scarf for one of her nephews. Outside, the village was wrapped in mist again, the world shrinking to a quiet circle of lamplight and rain. She spoke without looking up. "I believe, my dear, that Mrs. Latham's sorrow is not for a missing husband, but for a plan that did not go quite as smoothly as intended." Mrs. Bartlett gasped. "You mean she—" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes. I fear the good captain is no longer among the living, but we mustn't rush. These things have a way of revealing themselves, through the smallest details. A careless word, a stain that will not wash away. Or perhaps the way a woman forgets which story she told last." The old clock struck 9. In the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "The perfect marriage," she murmured. "How very rarely it is what it seems, and how often it ends not with a farewell, but with a gunshot no one hears." Chapter 3. The evening of the argument. The rain had passed, leaving the air washed clean and faintly metallic, as though the whole village had been polished overnight. From her window at Mrs. Bartlett's cottage, Miss Marple could see the distant roof of Ashcombe House, its chimneys rising against a bruised sky. It looked still and self-contained, the way some houses do when they are holding their breath. In the days since Captain Latham's disappearance, the police had found nothing of note, no footprints, no witnesses, no trace of travel. It was as if the man had simply dissolved into the mist. Yet in a village like Ashcombe Hill, silence itself can be evidence. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the truth of any crime often lies in what people choose not to mention. That morning the inspector had called at Mrs. Bartlett's house, his manner brisk and faintly irritated. "I tell you, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat and wiping his brow, "we're chasing ghosts. I've questioned half the county, and still no word of Captain Latham. Not a railway ticket, not a letter, not a single sighting." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And Mrs. Latham, Inspector? Has her story changed?" Graves frowned. "No, not exactly. She still claims he went to meet Major Pembroke that evening. But Pembroke insists no such meeting was planned. She says he must have gone off to clear his head. And yet—" "And yet," Miss Marple finished for him gently. "His wallet, watch and uniform were found still in his wardrobe." He nodded grimly. "Quite so. If he left, he did so with nothing but the clothes on his back. Doesn't sit right, does it?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. "No, Inspector. Men don't vanish neatly. Women do tidy things neatly, but men— rarely." That afternoon she made her way to the village lane that wound past the Lathams' home. She had no official reason for going, only curiosity, though Miss Marple's curiosity, as many had discovered, was the most efficient investigative tool in England. The fog hung low over the fields, muffling sound. Near the hedge she encountered Tommy Hall, the Lathams' gardener, a quiet young man with mud on his boots and worry in his eyes. "Good day, Tommy," said Miss Marple cheerfully. Time for the household, I imagine." He shifted uneasily. "Aye, ma'am. Terrible business." "I suppose you were here the evening Captain Latham went missing?" Tommy hesitated, then nodded. "Was finishing the trimming near the back lawn. It were near 8 o'clock when I heard them. The Captain and Mrs. Latham quarrelling." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "A quarrel? Over what, I wonder?" "Couldn't hear proper," Tommy said, rubbing his cap. But her voice was sharp, angry, like. Then I heard a crash. Sounded like a glass breaking, and him saying, 'You've gone too far, Jenny.' That's what I remember, clear as daylight." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And after that?" Tommy frowned. "Nothing for a bit. Then I thought I heard her crying, soft-like. I left soon after." "Did you mention this to the police?" He looked nervous. "Didn't think it was my place, ma'am. Mrs. Latham's been good to me, paid me even when there weren't much work." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "Goodness, yes, you did quite right not to speculate. Still, sometimes small things are the only things that matter." By evening, Miss Marple had quietly collected more fragments of the puzzle. Mrs. Plummer, the former housekeeper, mentioned that on the night of the argument, Mrs. Latham had dismissed the maid early, an unusual act for a woman who preferred her household to run under watchful eyes. The post office clerk recalled a telegram from that very day addressed to Mrs. Latham, though its contents were unknown, and the milkman, who prided himself on punctuality, mentioned that 2 mornings later Mrs. Latham had met him at the gate herself, for the first time in months, to tell him the family wouldn't be needing deliveries for a while. When Miss Marple quietly pieced these together, a picture began to form, one not of panic, but of planning. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire with Mrs. Bartlett, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Do you know, my dear," she said thoughtfully, "this case reminds me very much of poor Mr. Faraday in St. Mary Mead. Disappeared one fine autumn evening, and his wife was ever so calm about it. Kept saying he must have gone off fishing. It turned out she'd hit him over the head with the frying pan and buried him behind the compost heap. Terribly practical woman." Mrs. Bartlett gasped. "Jane, you can't compare this elegant creature to—" "Oh, can't I?" Miss Marple interrupted softly. "People are people, dear, no matter how elegant their drawing rooms. Anger has no manners." There was a knock at the door just then. It was Inspector Graves, his boots muddy, his coat damp. He looked flustered. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bartlett, forgive the intrusion. There's something new. One of the constables found a cartridge casing near the hedge behind Ashcombe House. 9mm. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "A gun, then?" Possibly, Graves said, though Mrs. Latham claims her husband kept no weapons in the house. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Ah, but many officers keep one old revolver from service, Inspector, a keepsake, a symbol of bravery, and sometimes of something far more personal. The inspector sighed. We'll be searching the grounds again at first light. If there's something buried there, we'll find it. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. I quite agree, but if you'll forgive an old woman's interference, you might also check whether Mrs. Latham ordered any heavy trunks or storage boxes lately, something large enough to move, well, a burden. The following morning dawned pale and wet. Miss Marple, ever curious, strolled past the property again just as two constables were leaving. They had found nothing new, though one mentioned that the back door locks had been changed recently. New bolts, polished clean. Miss Marple paused at the gate, looking up at the windows. In the upper room, the master bedroom, she presumed, the curtains were drawn tight, though sunlight leaked faintly around the edges. She smiled to herself, that soft, knowing smile that had unnerved murderers before now. Curtains drawn in daylight, she murmured, either to hide the dark or to conceal a stain. That evening, Jennifer Latham invited the vicar and his wife for supper, a gesture, she said, to take her mind off things. The vicar's wife later told Mrs. Bartlett that Jennifer had seemed oddly serene. She spoke of Matthew as though he'd simply gone away on business, the woman said. No tears, no trembling, only a sort of weariness. I remember she said, sometimes absence is kinder than truth. I found it rather chilling. Miss Marple listened quietly, her eyes half closed. Chilling indeed, especially when one realizes that absence, in this case, might not be voluntary. The next day, the first true break in the case appeared. A cyclist passing the village bridge noticed something odd floating in the stream below, a torn scrap of linen stiffened by mud and water. When it was retrieved, it proved to be a shirt cuff, the kind belonging to Captain Latham's uniform, and the initials ML embroidered faintly in blue thread. Inspector Graves examined it grimly. So he didn't vanish of his own accord. No, Miss Marple said quietly, looking down at the fragment. He didn't vanish. He was erased, as carefully as one erases a word from a letter. But a trace always remains, Inspector. Ink never truly disappears. She looked up at the great house on the hill, its windows glinting dully through the fog. Mark my words, she said softly. The evening of that argument was the end of Captain Latham, and the beginning of Mrs. Latham's undoing. Chapter 4. The Lover's Confession. The first frost of November had silvered the hedgerows when whispers began to creep through Ashcombe Hill. Whispers not of grief, but of impropriety. It started with the grocer's assistant, who swore she had seen Mrs. Latham speaking rather closely with a stranger by the old railway bridge one evening. Then a letter carrier mentioned a new name appearing regularly on the envelopes delivered to Ashcombe House, a Mr. Henry Whittaker of London. In a village like Ashcombe Hill, one does not need proof for the truth to begin forming. Miss Marple, who had returned from a brief stay at the vicarage, noticed the change immediately. The tone with which people now spoke of Jennifer Latham had softened from pity to suspicion. The calm composure that had once impressed the villagers now unsettled them. She's far too controlled, Mrs. Bartlett said one afternoon, as she and Miss Marple sat by the fire. I saw her at the grocer's this morning, buying lamb and wine. She said she'd grown tired of morning meals. Can you imagine? Not a tear, not even a tremor. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Grief wears many faces, my dear, but the absence of one altogether is rarely a good sign. Mrs. Bartlett shuddered. The inspector says there's a London man she's been writing to, a Mr. Whittaker. He came to visit her twice in September. Indeed. Miss Marple looked mildly interested, though a small light kindled behind her eyes. I should very much like to make Mr. Whittaker's acquaintance. By that week's end, she did. Henry Whittaker arrived quietly at the village inn. A man in his mid-30s, smooth-faced and nervous, with the kind of moustache that trembles before its owner does. The innkeeper, who knew Miss Marple well, mentioned his name over breakfast, and by mid-afternoon the elderly lady was seated beside him in the lounge, knitting bag at her side and a twinkle of innocent curiosity in her eye. "You're visiting Ashcombe Hill for business, Mr. Whittaker?" she asked pleasantly, as though making mere conversation. He hesitated. Yes, business of a sort. I'm an accountant." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Though I do believe I saw you at the churchyard yesterday morning, standing by the yew trees. An unusual place for accounting." He turned red. I just needed some air." "Of course," she said kindly. "Loss can weigh heavily, can't it? You knew Captain Latham, I think?" His teacup clinked faintly as he set it down. "Yes, I knew her husband." There it was, the slip Miss Marple had been waiting for. Her husband, past tense and not even noticed. "Mrs. Latham must have found great comfort in your friendship," she said gently. He rubbed his hands together, staring at the fire. "It wasn't meant to be like this," he muttered. "We met last spring in London, at a charity dinner. She said she was trapped, unhappy. I believed her." Miss Marple's voice remained light, almost grandmotherly. "And you cared for her?" "Yes," he said in a low voice. "We both wanted a new start. She told me she'd leave him soon, but when she visited me in September, she was different, cold, distant. She said she was making plans, that everything would be resolved before the end of the month." Miss Marple's fingers paused briefly on her knitting needles. "Resolved, you say? A curious choice of word." He swallowed. "I didn't understand then what she meant. I do now." The fire crackled softly between them. Miss Marple said nothing, giving him space to go on, and he did, haltingly, heavily. "She came to me a week after the news broke. She looked hollow. I offered to help, but she said it was too late. Then she told me everything." Miss Marple's eyes lifted quietly from her knitting. "Everything?" "Yes. She said she'd shot him while he slept. Said it was peaceful, almost merciful. She spoke of it as though it were housekeeping, tidying up a mistake. I didn't want to believe it. I thought she was mad or testing me, but she showed me the bruise on her arm, said she got it moving the body." He took a deep breath. "I couldn't sleep for days, so when she called me again, 2 nights later, I recorded it. I had to. She talked about him as if he weren't a person at all. She said he wasn't Matt anymore, just something that had to be gone." Miss Marple's knitting stopped entirely. "And you have this recording still, Mr. Whittaker?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. I kept it locked in my car. I didn't know what to do. I loved her once, you see. But when she said those things—" He looked up, eyes hollow. "I saw what she truly was." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Then you must go to the police, my dear man. Not out of anger, but out of decency. The truth has a way of surfacing, but it's kinder when guided by conscience." Later that evening, as the church bell tolled 6, Miss Marple sat opposite Inspector Graves in his small office at the police station. He looked tired, his sleeves rolled up, papers scattered before him. "You're telling me this man has a recording of her confession?" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "though I should prefer to call it an unintentional revelation. A liar, Inspector, always forgets to watch their own verbs. Mrs. Latham speaks of her husband in the past tense before the world believed him dead. It is the kind of truth one cannot rehearse away." Graves sighed deeply. "You've done it again, Miss Marple, always finding the thread the rest of us overlook." She smiled faintly. "It's not the thread, Inspector. It's how one sees the fabric. Now I imagine you'll wish to speak with Mr. Whittaker. Gently, I hope. He is frightened, and with reason. Mrs. Latham has more steel in her than a rifle barrel." That night, word spread that the police had paid a discreet visit to the inn. By morning, the entire village knew that the London gentleman had spoken to the authorities. Mrs. Latham, meanwhile, continued her performance of quiet suffering. She attended church, accepted condolences, and even hosted a small tea for the vicar's wife. But Miss Marple, sitting 2 pews behind her that Sunday, saw the tremor at the edge of Jennifer's gloved hand as the hymn book slipped. A small thing, invisible to most, but not to her. "Guilt," Miss Marple thought, "is like bad lace. It always unravels at the corner first." The next day, Inspector Graves called at Mrs. Bartlett's cottage again, this time with a glint of grim satisfaction. "The recording was quite something," he said. "She doesn't admit the act outright, not in so many words, but she speaks of him as though he were already dead. And she says, 'I had to make it quiet, he wouldn't stop shouting.' That's as close to a confession as one can get." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The human heart, Inspector, often betrays itself long before the tongue does. And now, I suspect, Mrs. Latham will begin to feel the walls closing in." That evening, the fog rolled in thick from the fields, muffling every sound but the distant hoot of an owl. From her window, Miss Marple could see Ashcombe House faintly through the haze, a lone light burning in an upper window. She watched it for a long moment and murmured softly to herself, "She's not thinking of repentance, poor creature. She's thinking of escape." But the mind that plans so coldly rarely leaves itself a door to flee through. As the clock struck 9, she folded her knitting, laid it neatly beside her chair, and whispered, "The confession is made. Now comes the clean-up, and the scent of bleach will lead us all the way to the truth." Chapter 5. The Scent of Bleach. The first thing Miss Marple noticed that cold Tuesday morning was the smell. It drifted faintly through the hedge as she walked past Ashcombe House, a sharp, acrid tang that clung to the damp air and stung the nose. Most passers-by might have ignored it, attributing it to cleaning day or a freshly scrubbed floor. But Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know the many perfumes of guilt, paused mid-step. "Bleach," she murmured softly, "and far too much of it." She stood for a moment longer, her breath clouding before her, gazing up at the great house. The windows were wide open despite the chill, and on the gravel drive stood a delivery cart, the sort that came from the furniture shop in town. 2 men were carrying a rolled carpet and what appeared to be a brand-new mattress up the steps. Miss Marple's pale eyes glinted behind her spectacles. "Replacing furniture, are we, Mrs. Latham? And so soon after your husband's disappearance. That is, efficient." Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves called at Mrs. Bartlett's cottage once again. His face was drawn, his expression grim. "We've just searched the Latham residence again," he said, settling into the armchair opposite Miss Marple. "Had a warrant this time. You were right about the bleach." "I usually am," she said mildly, folding her knitting into her lap. "Do tell me, Inspector. What did you find?" Graves took a deep breath. The bedroom floorboards had been scrubbed raw. There's a patch of carpet missing near the bed. Replaced hastily, I'd say. The smell of disinfectant was so strong it made the constable cough. And under the bed frame, he hesitated. A stain, faint but visible. Blood. Mrs. Bartlett gasped from the corner. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple's face remained composed, though her tone softened. "Then I fear my earlier suspicion is now a certainty. Poor Captain Latham never left his home alive." The inspector nodded. "Forensics will confirm it, but I'd wager it's his. There's more. We found an invoice for a new mattress dated 2 days after his disappearance, signed by Mrs. Latham herself." "Ah," Miss Marple said quietly. "I imagine she told the deliverymen it was for spring cleaning. Murderers are dreadfully fond of tidy explanations." Graves gave a low chuckle despite himself. "You've a sharp wit, Miss Marple, but I'll tell you something. She's slippery, that one. When we questioned her, she smiled, offered us tea, said she'd only been cleaning because the house smelled musty, never flinched once. "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple gently. "The guilty rarely do, at first. You see, Inspector, murderers don't fear discovery half as much as they fear losing control. But control, like bleach, fades with time. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the kind of day when even the sparrows seem reluctant to sing. Miss Marple rose early, wrapped her shawl tight, and walked to the green where a group of villagers had gathered to gossip. Among them was Mrs. Haynes, the Lathams' former cleaner, a small, anxious woman with ink-stained fingers and an unfortunate habit of speaking in whispers, even when no one required her to. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, as the elderly lady approached. "You won't believe what I saw yesterday, and they've replaced the whole bed. A fine new mattress brought in, and the old one taken out, rolled up in sacking." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, pretending mild surprise. "And who arranged the collection?" "Mrs. Latham herself, ma'am. Said the old one was unsightly and not fit for use, but the delivery man— I know his wife, you see— told her it was heavier than it should have been, said it reeked of chemicals." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though inwardly she felt the final knot of the story tighten. "Thank you, Mrs. Haynes," she said kindly. "You've been most helpful. You see, even the most dreadful secrets tend to cling to things, fabrics, carpets, mattresses. A crime can be hidden, but it cannot be washed away entirely." That evening, Inspector Graves arrived again, this time with a spark of excitement. "We've got it, Miss Marple. We lifted traces of blood from the floorboards and the bed frame. It matches the captain's blood type. And that's not all. We found fibres from the mattress stuffing in the boot of Mrs. Latham's car." Miss Marple looked up calmly. "Then she used it to transport the body, I suppose. Clever in its way, concealing him within something that already smelled of soap and ammonia." The inspector sighed. "It's ghastly, isn't it? She killed him in his sleep, if what the lover said is true. Cold-blooded." "Not cold, Inspector," Miss Marple corrected softly. "Calculated. There's a difference. Coldness is a lack of feeling. Calculation is the result of too much of it." I dare say she convinced herself she had good reason. Jealousy, perhaps, or fear of losing her standing. The human mind is dreadfully inventive when it wishes to justify a crime. Graves rubbed his forehead. "And now?" "She still refuses to admit anything. Says she was cleaning mildew." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mildew never seeps under bed frames, Inspector, nor does it bleed." That night, the two of them returned to Ashcombe House under the pretext of a further inspection. The rooms were silent and gleaming, the air heavy with the cloying scent of lavender polish. Mrs. Latham met them at the door, her expression serene. "Inspector," she said sweetly. "Miss Marple, how very unexpected. I do hope there's some news of my husband." "None yet, I'm afraid," Graves replied. "But we must ask a few more questions, a mere formality." "Of course," she said, leading them toward the drawing-room. Miss Marple followed quietly, her gaze drifting over the pristine surfaces. The house was immaculate, too immaculate. Not a cushion was out of place, not a trace of life left visible. It was like stepping into a room that had been preserved rather than lived in. As Mrs. Latham poured tea, Miss Marple allowed her eyes to wander to the faint outline on the wallpaper where a picture frame had recently hung. The area was cleaner than the rest, scrubbed, almost, as though something unpleasant had once been splattered there. "How beautifully kept your home is," Miss Marple said softly. "It must have taken quite an effort to make it so spotless after everything." Jennifer smiled faintly, though her fingers trembled as she set the teapot down. "A woman must keep busy, Miss Marple. It helps with one's nerves." "Of course," said Miss Marple gently. "Though nerves, I find, are rarely soothed by the smell of bleach." The woman froze for half a heartbeat. It was barely perceptible, the tightening of the jaw, the faint flutter at her throat. But to Miss Marple, it was as clear as a confession. "You have such a sharp nose," Jennifer said coolly, regaining her composure. "I suppose one must at your age." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Yes, my dear. Age teaches one to recognize many scents, especially the kind that linger after all others have faded." When they left the house, the night was dark and damp, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. The inspector exhaled heavily. "You got under her skin, Miss Marple, I saw it." "That was the idea," she said quietly. "A guilty conscience is like a caged bird. The more you tap at the bars, the more it beats its wings. Sooner or later, she'll break." Graves nodded. "Tomorrow we'll bring her in for formal questioning. Between the blood, the mattress, and the recording, the case is nearly airtight." Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze still fixed upon the house. "Nearly," she repeated softly, "but not entirely. There remains the matter of what she did with him. Until the captain's body is found, she'll cling to her story, as though denial might bleach away the truth just as she tried to scrub her floor." The wind rose gently through the trees, carrying with it a faint, lingering trace of ammonia. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter and whispered to herself, "You can wash away blood, Mrs. Latham, but never the scent of conscience." Chapter 6. The Journey North. A pale, wintry sun rose over Ashcombe Hill the next morning, struggling through a thin veil of fog. The trees were rimmed with frost, and the air held that peculiar stillness that precedes revelation. The hush before the unmasking. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table with her knitting beside her untouched tea. She had been awake since dawn, her thoughts running along quiet, careful lines. The picture was nearly complete, only one piece remained missing: the journey. It was not enough to prove that Jennifer Latham had killed her husband. A jury, Miss Marple knew, would require a body, and bodies, like lies, rarely vanish without trace. Inspector Graves arrived at 8:30, stamping the frost from his boots and looking uncharacteristically pleased. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his hands together. "We've got something new. The post office clerk found records of telegrams Mrs. Latham sent on the 21st. One to her parents in Derbyshire, saying she'd visit soon, and another to a certain Mr. Whittaker telling him, 'It's done, don't worry.'" Miss Marple's eyes brightened behind her spectacles. "Ah, yes. The day after the murder, if we assume our timeline is correct, and the following day she left the village, did she not?" Graves nodded. "According to her statement, she drove north to her parents' home, stayed one night, returned the next afternoon." "And did anyone actually see her there?" He frowned. "Her parents confirmed it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Parents, Inspector, are much inclined to believe what their daughters tell them, even when the truth smells faintly of petrol and wet earth." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You think she didn't go straight there?" "I think," said Miss Marple calmly, "she took a detour, a place quiet and remote enough to dig, yet close enough to reach before dawn." That afternoon, Miss Marple and the inspector visited the petrol station at the edge of the village. It was run by a cheerful man named Mr. Pike, who knew every customer by the sound of their motor. "Mrs. Latham?" he said when they asked. "Oh, yes, she came by that Saturday, early, before sunup. Said she was off to see her folks. I remember because she looked proper pale and asked me to check her back tyres. They were caked in mud. Odd, since the main road was dry." "Mud, you say?" murmured Miss Marple. "Thick and clay-like?" He nodded. "Aye, red clay, like what you get up toward Bramble Hollow." The inspector shot her a look. "That's miles north, near the old quarry." "Precisely," said Miss Marple, her eyes gleaming. "A forgotten place, abandoned since the war, perfect for burying things one wishes never to see again." 2 days later they drove out to Bramble Hollow with a small search party and a spade or two. The land was bleak and overgrown, half-frozen puddles glinting between clumps of brown grass, and a silence so complete that even the birds seemed wary of breaking it. Miss Marple stood wrapped in her shawl, surveying the ground with patient precision. She would not have gone far from the road. she said quietly. Not alone, not in the dark. But she is tidy, our Mrs. Latham. She'd want the spot to look undisturbed, perhaps somewhere half hidden by nature itself. Inspector Graves gestured toward a line of birch trees. We'll start there, near the slope. An hour passed. Then came a shout from one of the constables. Sir, over here! They hurried to the edge of the ridge, where a small mound of disturbed earth lay beneath a rotting wooden board. Beneath it, they uncovered a half-collapsed storage container, the sort used for luggage or linens. The lid was cracked, the hinges rusted, and within it they found a few tattered scraps of cloth, thick with dried mud. Graves knelt, his voice grim. Bloodstains, old but still visible. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Oh, so that was where she hid him," she said softly. "Not forever, though. Murder seldom buries well. The earth has a way of telling its stories." By the time they returned to the village, word had spread like wildfire, as it always does. People came out of their cottages to whisper, to speculate, to stare at the police cars rolling through the lane. Ashcombe Hill, usually so serene, now buzzed with the quiet thrill of scandal. Mrs. Bartlett met Miss Marple at the gate, her face pale with excitement. "Is it true? They've found something?" "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly. "Not all, but enough. The rest, I suspect, will come in time." Mrs. Bartlett shivered. "Oh, Jane, how dreadful! And to think I once admired that woman. So graceful, so proper." "Ah," said Miss Marple with a faint smile. "The most dangerous women are often the ones most proper. They kill not in passion but in punctuation. Neat, precise, and without a smudge out of place." That evening, as dusk fell and the village lights blinked to life one by one, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Graves in the parlour once more. "She's clever," the inspector admitted, "planned every detail, took the children to her parents beforehand, made sure the maid was gone, even ordered cleaning supplies in advance. She thought she could make it perfect." Miss Marple nodded. "But perfection is a brittle thing, Inspector. It cracks under the smallest truth. In this case, a patch of mud, a faint smell of bleach, a letter sent too soon. Her mistake was believing that order could cover sin." He leaned back, wearily. "We'll bring her in again tomorrow, with what we've got. The blood, the mattress, the container. I think we can charge her." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. Then, after a pause, "But I'd caution you to be gentle. Women like Mrs. Latham do not go down quietly. She'll fight to the end, not out of remorse, but pride. It's a dreadful thing, pride. It keeps people tidying their souls when what they really need is to confess." That night, Ashcombe Hill slept uneasily. The fog crept back through the lanes, wrapping the cottages in ghostly shrouds. From her window, Miss Marple watched the light, still burning in Jennifer Latham's upstairs room. It flickered occasionally as though the woman were pacing. Miss Marple sighed softly. "The journey north," she whispered, "was never about distance. It was about conscience. She buried him, but she cannot bury herself." She turned from the window, the firelight casting her shadow long across the wall. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "will be the beginning of her unravelling." Chapter 7. The Woman. Behind the Smile. The morning after the search at Bramble Hollow dawned grey and bitterly still, as though the entire village were holding its breath. Frost glistened along the hedgerows, and smoke rose in thin spirals from the chimneys. The people of Ashcombe Hill, who had whispered for weeks about Captain Latham's disappearance, now whispered about something far darker: the discovery. Inside her guest room at Mrs. Bartlett's cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting folded neatly beside her. She had not slept much, not because she was shocked — human cruelty rarely shocked her any more — but because she had seen the look in Jennifer Latham's eyes the previous evening when the inspector had brought her in for questioning. It was not fear, not remorse. It was defiance. A quiet, steely pride that refused to break, even as the walls began to close in. By mid-morning, Inspector Graves called for Miss Marple. "We're bringing her in again," he said, fastening his coat. "She's agreed to speak, but I can't get through to her. Keeps saying she's done nothing wrong. Thought maybe you could try." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Ah, you mean perhaps that she might speak more freely to another woman, particularly one old enough to seem harmless?" Graves gave a weary smile. "Something like that." "Very well," she said softly. "But I shall need tea. Murder, I've found, often begins to loosen its grip over a teacup." They met in the small drawing-room of the police station, a room meant to look comforting but failing miserably, with its peeling wallpaper and faint smell of damp tobacco. Jennifer Latham sat by the window, wearing a dark green coat and a pair of immaculate gloves. Her hair was arranged perfectly, as though she were attending a luncheon rather than an interrogation. When Miss Marple entered, Jennifer looked up, her expression polite but cool. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I understand you've taken a great interest in my misfortunes." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Only as much as any old lady might, my dear. One grows rather fond of stories, especially those that wish to hide their ending." Jennifer tilted her head. "You think I'm hiding something?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, we all hide something, Mrs. Latham. You hide yours rather beautifully, like a wrinkle under powder. But powder does not last long, I'm afraid." A faint smile crossed Jennifer's lips. "You speak as though you already know what happened." "I know enough," said Miss Marple gently. "Enough to understand that your husband never left that house alive. Enough to know you cleaned, scrubbed, and buried what you thought no one would find. But what I truly wish to understand, my dear, is why." For the first time, Jennifer's composure wavered. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, tightened slightly. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly. "You've never been trapped. Never lived with someone who made you feel small every day." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Oh, but I have known many women who have, some who endured, and others who destroyed. Yet I always find it curious. It's rarely cruelty that drives a woman to kill, but pride. A refusal to be seen as less." Jennifer's eyes flashed. "You think I did it for pride?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "you did it because he no longer looked at you the way he once did, and because someone else did." A silence followed, sharp as glass. Then Jennifer laughed, a brittle, unnatural sound. "You mean Henry Whittaker, the poor, frightened man who ran to the police? He never loved me. He worshipped me. There's a difference." "And Captain Latham?" asked Miss Marple quietly. Jennifer's smile faded. "He pitied me, and pity is the most humiliating affection of all." Her voice trembled now, not with guilt, but with anger long stored away. "He made me feel invisible, Miss Marple, always so calm, so superior, so patient. I hated that patience. He'd look at me as though I were a child throwing a tantrum. I wanted him to see me, really see me, even if it was for the last time." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her tone almost maternal. "So, you waited until he slept?" Jennifer turned sharply toward the window, her jaw clenched. "I didn't mean to. I only wanted to frighten him. But when I saw him lying there, so still, so sure of his power, I realized that I could end it. All the scorn, the silence, the waiting. One pull of a trigger, and it would all be quiet." Her words faded into the frost-tinged air. Outside, the faint caw of a crow echoed across the field. Miss Marple spoke after a long pause. "And yet it wasn't quiet, was it? You've been hearing him ever since?" Jennifer's head turned slowly. "What do you mean?" "The house," Miss Marple said softly. "You keep it spotless, too spotless. You open the windows to let out the smell of bleach, but really, it's the memory you're trying to air out. Every polish, every scrub, you're still cleaning what can't be cleaned." Jennifer's lips trembled slightly. "You think you know everything, don't you? You sit there with your knitting and your clever little observations, but you don't know what it's like to live in a cage." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "but I know what it's like to see a woman build one herself and call it home." For a long moment they said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, and a faint ray of winter sunlight touched the rim of Jennifer's teacup. Then Jennifer spoke again, her voice low, almost weary. "You know, I told myself it would be a mercy, that he was tired, that he wanted release. I even prayed afterward, though I don't think God was listening." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "He always listens, my dear. It's just that sometimes he waits for us to stop lying, not to others, but to ourselves." Jennifer's breath caught. Her eyes glistened briefly, then hardened once more. "You think I'll confess to you, don't you? You think I'll break?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, no, my dear. I think you already have. Only you haven't realized it yet." When Miss Marple left the station, the frost had melted into thin rivulets along the cobblestones. The inspector met her at the door, his brow furrowed. "Well?" he asked. Miss Marple sighed softly. She confessed, not in words, but in everything else. She is a woman who cannot bear to be ordinary, and murder was her way of proving she wasn't. Graves nodded grimly. "We'll charge her today. Between the evidence and the lover's recording, the case is complete." "Almost," Miss Marple said quietly. "But remember, Inspector, when you remove pride from such a woman, you remove her purpose. Watch her carefully tonight." That evening, Ashcombe Hill fell silent once more. The great house stood dark against the horizon, its windows empty. Inside the police cell, Jennifer Latham sat motionless, staring at her gloved hands. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll. Miss Marple, back in Mrs. Bartlett's parlour, listened to their echo and spoke softly into the stillness. She was beautiful, intelligent, proud, and utterly blind to the truth that love cannot be commanded nor loyalty bought. In her vanity, she believed she'd cleaned every trace, but conscience, like dust, always settles again. She folded her knitting, extinguished the lamp, and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow will bring confession, and perhaps at last, peace." Chapter 8. The Quiet Confession. The drawing-room of Ashcombe House had never looked so empty. The fire had been lit, though its warmth did little to soften the chill that hung in the air. Pale morning light filtered through half-drawn curtains, catching the dust that danced lazily in the stillness. The same room that had once seen elegant teas and polite laughter now seemed stripped bare, a stage waiting for its final act. Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair near the hearth, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. Across from her stood Inspector Graves, his posture firm, but his eyes watchful. A constable lingered near the door, his notebook ready. And in the centre of it all sat Jennifer Latham, the widow of Ashcombe Hill. She was dressed in mourning black, her hat resting on the table beside her. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes cool and detached. She had asked to return to her home one last time, for the sake of closure, as she put it. The inspector had agreed on Miss Marple's advice, because Miss Marple knew. It was not the law that would make Jennifer Latham confess, it was the house itself. For a time there was only silence. The clock ticked evenly on the mantel, each sound echoing faintly in the hollow room. Finally Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft, almost kind. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said, "how a house remembers. We may wash the walls, replace the carpets, even repaint the window sills. Yet something always lingers, the scent perhaps, or the silence." Jennifer looked up slowly. "If you mean to moralize, Miss Marple, I've heard enough sermons from the inspector." "I don't sermonize, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "I simply observe. And this house has told me quite a story." Jennifer gave a faint, weary smile. "Then perhaps you should write a book." "Oh, I couldn't possibly," said Miss Marple mildly. "I've never cared much for fiction." I prefer things that truly happened, and how they happened to happen." The inspector cleared his throat, but Miss Marple raised a hand delicately, as if to say, "Not yet." She continued, her tone unhurried. "You see, Mrs. Latham, it was the smell that gave you away first, not the lavender polish, though that was laid on thick enough to choke a saint, but the faint tang beneath it. Ammonia, bleach, the scent of a conscience trying very hard to clean itself." Jennifer's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened on her handkerchief. "Then, of course," Miss Marple went on, "there was the matter of the new mattress you ordered just 2 days after your husband's disappearance, and the missing carpet cut neatly beneath the bed. You see, a hurried crime is often clumsy, but yours was tidy, too tidy, every detail carefully arranged. You removed the traces, but you left the pattern." "I was redecorating," Jennifer said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, of course. Redecorating is such a comfort after bereavement. But the thing about blood, Mrs. Latham, is that it seeps into the wood. It never quite leaves, no matter how hard one scrubs. Inspector Graves found it beneath the boards, precisely where your husband's head would have lain." A flicker crossed Jennifer's face, then vanished as quickly as it came. "And then," Miss Marple said, leaning slightly forward, "there was your little journey north. You thought you'd been clever, driving in the dark, stopping before dawn. But petrol leaves a trail just as surely as footprints. The mud from Bramble Hollow on your tires, the receipts in your purse, the container buried under the birch trees, all of it spoke quite plainly." Jennifer's lips parted, but no words came. The inspector's eyes stayed fixed on her. "And finally," Miss Marple said softly, "there was your tongue, my dear. So elegant, so well trained, but even the most polished woman cannot guard her verbs. You spoke of your husband in the past tense before anyone else knew he was gone. 'He wasn't Matt anymore,' you said to your lover. A small sentence, but terribly revealing." Jennifer let out a slow, trembling breath. "You've no idea what it was like, Miss Marple, to live with a man who looked through you as though you weren't there. He made me feel like a shadow in my own home." "Then why not leave?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Why not take the children and start anew?" Jennifer's voice sharpened. "Because he'd have taken everything. The house, the money, the children, all of it. He'd have made me the villain, and everyone would have believed him, always the perfect captain, the noble soldier." Her tone turned bitter. He thought himself untouchable. "Even when I told him about Henry, he just looked at me, with that calm, cold look, as though I were nothing. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand that silence." Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. "So you silenced him?" For a moment, Jennifer said nothing. The ticking of the clock filled the room again, steady and inexorable. Then she laughed softly, a laugh that broke halfway through. "I thought it would be over then. I thought I'd feel free. But I still hear him at night, in the walls, in the clock, even in the silence." Her hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, but she didn't lift it. Her eyes had gone glassy, unfocused. "I used to tell myself I'd done it for love," she said faintly, "that Henry would understand. But he was frightened of me. Everyone's frightened of me now, even my parents, even my own children." Tears welled in her eyes, but they did not fall. I cleaned and scrubbed and prayed, but the smell never left. I thought if I buried him deep enough, I could bury myself too. Miss Marple's gaze was calm, almost sorrowful. "Murder doesn't bury, my dear, it only plants, and what you planted has been growing ever since. Guilt, fear, and loneliness. A dreadful garden, but yours all the same." Jennifer pressed a hand to her face. "Do you think they'll hang me?" Miss Marple hesitated. "That is for others to decide, but I do hope, for your soul's sake, that you tell the truth before the judge makes you." There was silence again, long and heavy. Then Jennifer lowered her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, she said. "I did it." Inspector Graves stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised her hand once more. "Let her speak." Jennifer stared into the fire, her expression almost peaceful now. "He was sleeping. I remember the way the light fell on the curtains. I remember thinking, he looked so calm, and I couldn't bear it. I took his pistol from the drawer and it was so quick, just one sound and then nothing." Her voice cracked. "I dragged him down the stairs. He was so heavy. I told myself I was doing what had to be done, that no one would know. But it never leaves you, Miss Marple. You can wash the sheets, burn the clothes, scrub the walls. But the house knows, and it waits." She bowed her head into her hands and wept, quietly, almost gracefully, as if even her grief must remain composed. When it was over, the constable led her away, her steps slow but steady. The front door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Inspector Graves stood by the mantel, rubbing his jaw. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. How you manage it, I'll never know." Miss Marple smiled faintly, gathering her knitting. "Oh, it wasn't I who managed it, Inspector. It was her. She wanted to confess. She only needed someone to listen without judgment." Graves nodded slowly. "Still, it's justice in the end." "Justice," said Miss Marple, "is a curious thing. It may begin with the law, but it ends with conscience." She rose, glanced once toward the now empty chair where Jennifer had sat, and sighed softly. Poor woman. She polished her life so carefully that she never saw what was cracking beneath the varnish. As she stepped out into the cold morning, the mist rolled once more across Ashcombe Hill, soft and white, as though trying to hide the house from memory. The church bells began to ring in the distance, slow, solemn notes that echoed down the lane. Miss Marple pulled her shawl close and whispered, almost to herself, "There's no bleach strong enough for guilt, only truth." And with that, she walked on through the quiet village, her figure fading gently into the fog.